Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, Madame la Consul Générale, Madame la Conseillère Culturelle, all of our distinguished guests. We're very pleased to welcome you here for this very, very special occasion on which we're having the Ambassador of the U.S., Gérard Araud, speak to us about a topic that's of great concern. I'm just here briefly to say welcome on behalf of the Maison Française, the Alliance Program, and the European Institute, who've invited him to Colombia to speak to all of you. I just want to say briefly that I don't think it's possible to overstate the level of fear and anxiety and uncertainty that many Americans are feeling right now about the president who's about to take office in January. And among our many concerns is the effect this presidency will have on U.S. foreign relations, and in particular on our relationship with our oldest and best allies, and including France. Of course, there's also an election next year in France for a new president as well. So it's a time of, I think, grave uncertainty and concern about the future. We're hoping that we'll hear something reassuring from Ambassador Araud, who is here to talk about the future of relations between the U.S. and France and between the U.S. and Europe. So he will speak for a period of time, and then we'll have a discussion between him and Alexandre Stille, both of whom are going to be introduced briefly by Alexia Lefebvre, and then there will be time for questions and answers at the end. So thank you very much, and welcome everyone.
Dear friends, Ambassador Gérard Araud, someone very well known here at Columbia University. As you know, he's now the French ambassador to the United States since 2014, but he used to be in this particular city of New York already before as permanent representative of France to the United Nations. And in this capacity, he has come here to meet students at Columbia University, CIPA students in particular. He has always welcomed students from the United Nations program, alumni from Sciences Po and École Polytechnique, or both is alma mater. He's a diplomat, and not a diplomat like all the other diplomats. I can go over briefly his career. He held many different positions with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He has been Director of Strategic Affairs, Security and Disarmament, Ambassador of France to Israel, Director General for Political Affairs and Security, and in this capacity was the negotiator on Iran deal. But more interestingly, for those who don't know him, he has always been described by the media, by all those who work with him, by other diplomats, as someone very effective and himself defined it once as a fighter to advocate for France. He has been described more recently by the New York Times, by the Financial Times, as an intelligent, strong negotiator, outspoken, passionate as in contrast to the sometimes dry word of diplomacy. And I think you will have a hint of this personality in this discussion. Very briefly, before letting me say a few words, we asked Alexandre Stille, who is a professor of international journalism here at Columbia University, and this is not accidental. We asked precisely Sandro to come because not only he's a journalist and he's supposed to know how to moderate the discussion with someone so outspoken, but also because he is probably among the faculty here at the School of Journalism the closest to what is a French intellectual. That is to say that he's also an historian, a political scientist, a novelist, an author, and he knows very well European politics, in particular Italian and French politics. So we hoped with both of them to have a deep and stimulating conversation on this major issue in this major particular geopolitical context. Thank you very much, and Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you. I assure you that when she said that you were very close to a French intellectual, it was a compliment.
might be taken differently.
So I know, even in France, actually. No, thank you. It's great to be here. And, you know, I spent a lot of time in this country. I will never get rid of my accent. You know, that's something I'm not proud of it, actually. But I have to, you know, I'm come from Marseille, in the south of France. So I had a lot of reasons to have accents, you know, whether in French or in English. You know, talking about transatlantic relations, I want to start really by a point which is very important, you know, in foreign policy and I guess in your life, is never to get to consider as granted the sacred cows that really are offered to you. You know, and one of them is, of course, we should have a strong transatlantic relationship. Of course, you know, really, who doubts? You know, who could doubt it? Actually, if you look at history, at the history of the transatlantic relationship, since the very foundation of this country, you would be surprised because actually the strong transatlantic relationship is very recent. It's really, you can give the date, 1945, and it's also rooted in very specific historical circumstances. So I want to first, I guess, to insist on this first point. Contrary to what you may think, especially on the East Coast, especially in Columbia University, the transatlantic relationship, a strong transatlantic relationship, is not granted. You know, really, it's not. When your first president, George Washington, retired, you know, really all of you, you know that in his final address, he advised the Americans not to get into any entanglement with the Europeans. And in a sense, in the opposite way, when President Monroe in 1823, President Monroe said, you know, really that his country was opposing an European intervention into American affairs. It's more complicated than that, but basically that's what happened. You know, basically, we the Americans, we don't want to have anything to do with the Europeans, and you, the Europeans, you're not going to come here because at the time, in 1823, there was talks about European intervention to restore the Spanish authority on the former Spanish colonies. And that's what the Americans wanted to oppose. And basically, during all the 19th century, the United States remained pretty well an inward-looking country and really was keeping this sort of isolation from the European affairs. And it's very striking that, in a sense, the only major foreign intervention into the American affairs was in 1863. It was the most serious. We had a lot of silly actually in adventures in the French foreign policy, but this one is one of the serious, was the French intervention in Mexico, really to make an empire, to impose an emperor to the Mexican, and we could do it in 1863. Why? Because the United States at the time was really were through the Civil War, and so we're not in a position to oppose the French intervention. And if eventually we withdrew from Mexico in 1867, it's precisely because it was after the end of the Civil War, and we were feeling not only the resistance of the Mexicans, but also the growing pressure coming from the Americans. And if the US was inward looking, it's simply because it had something to do. It's simply the country was mobilized by the Western frontier. You know, really all the energy of the country was directed into the conquest of a continent. And to add to this energy, to this mobilization of the country, you had something which has been, I think, very common and very enduring, and which was a basic suspicion towards the European powers. European powers which were seen not only as a potential threat, but also as a sort of corrupt anti-model. You know, really, for the Americans, this idea of building a Jerusalem on the hill, you know, really it was in a clear opposition to the corruption to the ineffectiveness of the Europeans. Don't forget that basically this country has been created by Puritans, and Puritanism remained an essential trait of the American vision of the world. And the Americans, in a sense, could afford it. No, they could afford it because of the geography. Really, very often I tell my American friends, you are very bad at geopolitics because you have never had a geopolitical situation which would demand you to react in a geopolitical way. Because, you were isolated by the oceans. And again, it meant in the 19th century weeks, really weeks of navigation to come from Europe to the US, and weeks and more weeks to come from China or from Japan to the US. But your neighbors have never been a threat. Canada, 1812, and Mexico, it was the war of 1846-48, and frankly, it was not a very dangerous. It has never been a very dangerous neighbor. So in a sense, you could afford, really to live in your isolation. You had the energy, you had to mobilize your energy towards the conquest of the Wild West, and the contact that you had with Europe. Really, I think the best way for you to try to understand it is to read the novels. And I think, of course, you have to read Henry James. You have to read Edith Wharton for the people who consider that Henry James is too difficult. And you will understand, I think Henry James is one of my preferred writers. And you will understand a bit this mixture of really suspicion, but also fascination for the sins and the corruption of Europe that was especially seen from Boston. And I advise you to read, for instance, Portrait of a Lady by Henry James, who is an excellent, but you have also the Ambassadors, you have also really a lot of these novels. So basically you had rich Americans going to Europe to make a tour, really going to Rome, going to Florence, going to Paris. You had really buying art and creating their art collections. And from time to time, you were exporting young ladies who married ruined aristocrats. And really, because we love titles, even if you are Republicans. But you remained till the First World War. Again, I'm really caricaturing because we could speak of the war against Spain in 1898, we could speak about Theodore Roosevelt, but basically till the First World War, you remain, in a sense, largely aloof, largely out of the world. You had a look at China because you wanted to have a part in the Chinese game in the sense of the victim that you are killing. The Chinese game where everybody was rushing to try to plunder, to share, to divide China. So you wanted to be part of it. But basically, you were not part of alliances, you were not associated in major diplomatic affairs, and even you nearly went to war with Britain at the beginning of the 20th century when Britain pretended to intervene in Venezuela. So the one-war doctrine was still there. And so there was absolutely no surprise that in the First World War, when the First World War was declared, the US immediately announced that it would remain neutral. We are going to commemorate on April 6th the centennial of the entry into the war of the United States, because eventually, of course, you entered into the First World War, but you did it late, 1970, and you did it reluctantly. You did it because really, frankly, the Germans didn't let you the choice. You may know the infamous Zimmermann telegram, this incredible telegram sent by our German friends to their ambassador in Mexico, really saying that the Mexicans should invade the US, and in exchange of this invasion, Germany was promising Texas and New Mexico and California back to Mexico, which frankly was considered by the Americans, because the cable was intercepted by the British, who, out of friendship, gave it to the Germans, really. And after that, the Germans declared a sort of total submarine war, which means that the German submarine started to sink all the ships traveling around the British island and close to France, including the American ships, which didn't let any other choice for the Wilson administration than to declare war. But when you enter into the war, actually you did it on your own terms. You were not our allies. You refused to be considered as allies. And if you look at all the treaties and of the time, we said the allied and associate powers. You wanted to be associated to us, but not allied to us. President Wilson took its own initiatives, the famous 14 points, where he defined the goals of the war. He did it without any consultations of Britain and of France. And it's really very funny when you look at the reactions of Lloyd George in England and Clemenceau in France. They were totally furious against it. Really. President Wilson, really again tried to channel the negotiations in 1918 its way, and there was a lot of difficulties between Lloyd George, Clemenceau, and Wilson. But what is much more important is that, as you know, Wilson was defeated in the Senate. The Treaty of Versailles was not ratified. The Americans rushed out of Europe. It was the end of the American adventure into Europe. Actually, unfortunately, it was not the end, because the US administration between the two world wars conducted, I should say, the worst diplomacy that you can think of. For instance, really, one of the issues that we were facing after the war was, of course, the problem of the war debts. And for countries which have been devastated by the war, like France and Belgium, the war debts were totally was a major concerns, political, financial, human concerns. And there was a proposal by Britain was to say, okay, let's cancel all the war debts. And the Americans said, no way, you have to pay any dollar that actually of your war debts. The consequence, of course, was that the French and the Belgians said, okay, so we are obliged to find money somewhere, so we have to find it in Germany. Really, and it was the reparation crisis, and the American diplomacy intervened in Europe between the two world wars only about war debts. That was the only issue, but the Americans didn't want to take any responsibility, especially when Hitler arrived. Actually, when Hitler arrived, not only the Americans didn't take any responsibility, but they did the opposite. Because they voted the neutrality laws in 1936-37, which prevented the sale of American weapons to people engaged in the war, which could be only against the French and the British, because the Germans couldn't, couldn't come to the US because of the French and the American and French and British mastery of the sea. So it was a neutrality law which was directed basically against the French and against the British. Another example is the crisis of 1929. Really immediately in 1930, the Americans voted very stringent protectionist laws, which actually started the trade war in the world. Or in 1933, when Roosevelt, FDR, came to power, there was a conference in Europe, in London actually, where the British, the French were trying to rebuild the monetary system, which had been totally, in a sense, undermined by the crisis. And there was a very famous telegram sent by FDR to the conference saying, we don't care. We, the Americans, we don't want any coordination. We'll take our own decision on the basis of our own interest. And it was the collapse and the end of this trying, this effort to manage the monetary system after the 1920-21. So till the war, and again, you remember that the US entered the war not because they decided to enter the war, but because they were obliged to enter the war, because they were attacked by Japan 75 years ago, nearly to the day, and actually because Germany on December 12th, we are going also to commemorate this date, 12th December, Germany decided to declare war to the US. So there is a sort of pattern till the Second World War of the US, considering that it doesn't have, that its national interest is certainly not to be drawn into European quarrels. That actually, that's Europe, that's a continent which has been really, because of its shortcomings, because of the everything it's bad in European affairs, we the Americans, we shouldn't be part of it, and we have the incredible advantage of the geography, which is allowing us, in a sense, to do it. And there is a very moving letter by the French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud on the 14th of June 1940, where we were overwhelmed by the Germans, and Paul Reynaud sent a letter to Roosevelt saying, please do something. The democracy, the front of the democracy is defeated. France is overwhelmed. We need desperately your support. There was no answer. So the real transatlantic relationship, as we know it, and especially people from my generation know it, which means that, again, as a sort of granted reality, something which really we cherish and we have to defend, actually is quite, in a sense, in historical terms, is quite new. It's 1945. It's in 1945 that the Americans decided not to go back home. Why? Because really, frankly, UK was exhausted, France was ruined. So the conclusion was that the only way to prevent the Soviets from overcoming, of invading Western Europe was a strong American commitment. Because at the time it was it was considered as likely the idea that the Soviets wouldn't stop where they reached, where they were, and they will make the conquest of Western Europe, which was utterly destroyed and where communist ideas were spreading. So it's at this moment that the Americans decided to remain in Europe, and it's also at this moment that from the European side, out of gratitude, because of the Marshall Plan, but also because of the defense of Europe against the Soviet threat, really it's at this moment that was created the transatlantic relationship. And it's not by chance that the only institution where the Europeans and the Americans are sitting, the only table where we are sitting together and only together is the NAC, the North Atlantic Council, because it's NATO, military organization, which is the only organization, international organization, which is striking, the only international organization where Americans and Europeans are side by side. So strong, and the Americans also were supporting the European endeavor. People forget that what the Europeans did by building, European institutions since 1949, was largely under the pressure of the Americans, who considered that it was critical for the prosperity of Europe that the Europeans, really would associate themselves. And very often, I am used to say that European endeavor, European Union, has two godfathers, the President of the United States and the Pope. Because the Roman Catholic Church was really so, in a sense, afraid by the spread of the communism that there was a commitment of the Roman Catholic Church behind the European endeavor, and most of the big, really Schumann, De Gasperi, Konrad Adenauer were devout Catholics. So working together. Why? Because there was a common threat. There was the Soviet Union. That's the first pillar of what we did, and the second pillar was under an American leadership. You know, it was clearly and around the table of the North Atlantic Council. Basically, the American military expenditures has always represented between 70 and 80% of the military expenditures of all the alliance. So there was obviously a shareholder who had a major influence on the alliance. So 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, you know, in a sense, the fact also that Europe was prosperous, we could have thought that it was really, in a sense, why to work together. But it was the moment of the Western triumph. You know, people forget that the 90s was really the moment of the Western triumph, which led to European intervention in the Balkans, where we had a European-American intervention in the Balkans, really to restore peace in Kosovo. But there was also a lot of international treaties which were actually supported by the West. A lot of convention, human rights, convention of chemical weapons, the treaty on the missile, on the nuclear testing. You know, really, it was a moment of Western triumph where you had the impression that you could build. We were building, in a sense, an international society under. We love to say, really under our values. Actually, it was under our leadership. But really, that's really, we prefer to be more decent. So we speak about values. So the question, but more or less, this moment of Western triumph, you know, really the end of it more or less was the Iraq War in 2003, where suddenly it was a way of saying the emperor has no clothes. Really, the values, all the values that we were proud of were trampled, and where we had a very strong division suddenly among the Europeans and among the Americans. And it was just at the moment also that the balance of power in the international community started to shift with the emergence of China and other powers. And this rebalancing at our expense, in a sense, was accelerated by the crisis, the economic crisis of 2008. And if you look at the figures, they are extremely striking. In 2000, the GDP of China was equal to the GDP of Italy. In 2015, it's 6 times the GDP of Italy. The G7, you know, the G7 are basically, you know, really US, Canada, France, UK, Germany, Italy, and Japan, the more or less Western powers, were representing more than 50% of the world GDP. Today, we represent 29% of the world GDP. And I could add figures after figures. There was a general rebalancing of the really at the world at our expense. So what I want so that's the first, in a sense, that's the first challenge that we are facing, really. And it's a challenge not only in terms of power, but also in terms of the use of power. Because these countries, and we see it in Syria, we see it in Ukraine, we see it in the South China Sea, these countries are practicing in the most traditional way power politics. You know, in a sense, when I was joking about our values, we always have declared, and in a sense we have believed, that we were trying to build a world of values with what you call the liberal order. The liberal order, we believed in it, while actually the other countries didn't believe in it because they saw it as the Western order. But really, we tried to build a world based on multinational organizations, the rule of law, international treaty, while these new powers really either they say your values actually are a fig leaf on your Western ambitions, or simply saying we don't care. What matters is the balance of power. So that's really a sort of coming back to the diplomacy the way it was conducted before the the First World War, actually. So it's the first challenge. The second challenge is a domestic challenge. You know, very often, you know, when I was asked to explain the American politics, my first reaction was, my first words were to say, we are very different between Americans and Europeans. You know, really the difference is fundamental. And I should say that unfortunately for both of you, both of us, actually it's not anymore the case. You know, really, and because we are, again, Brexit, your presidential election, the presidential elections which is coming in France, the referendum in Italy, elections coming in the Netherlands in March. Everywhere we are facing the same wave of populism. So it means that this transatlantic world, you know, really from Vancouver or Seattle to Warsaw, really is facing the same challenge. A substantial part of our citizens are expressing their resentment, and in a sense, really are saying that really they are ready to toss the table. And that's something which is common. Of course, it will be expressed in different ways in England or in the US or in France, because we have historical circumstances. We have a different geography, human and geography, but actually, which is behind it is more or less the same crisis. So you have a transatlantic world, if it has still a meaning, which actually is really facing a double challenge. Challenge external, challenge domestic. And when you cut the head of a hen, is running. So there is a danger for the transatlantic relationship that we simply consider we have the transatlantic relationship, we love each other, we are spending vacation together, we are listening to the same music and looking at the same movies, usually yours. So it's enough. I do think it would be extremely dangerous if we were really doing it. I do think that what we need, in a sense, is to reinvent a transatlantic project. We need, and we have the basis to do it, because I've said we are facing the same threat. There is nothing better in foreign relations really to create an association to have a common threat. And we have a common threat. We have a common challenge. So I will give some examples. The first one was climate change, where, frankly, we worked in a great way together. What President Obama did by bringing the Chinese on board was critical for the success, which is, of course, mainly due to the French diplomacy. But really, of course, it is a common challenge, and we have been working together, and I hope that we can work together. Free trade everywhere. In Germany or in the US, there is a sort of rebellion against free trade. So what are we going to do? Are we going to throw the baby with the water of the bath, or are we going to redefine together what means free trade, which will be citizen-friendly? Is it possible today to answer to the questions, to the concerns raised by our citizens for a free trade agreement? What should be a modern free trade agreement? Tax avoidance. You know, all of us, we are facing the question of these big corporations which are playing around our laws and who are not paying tax. And it's bad. It's bad because of the citizens, because our citizens are saying, basically, the life is not fair, so it's very important to show that it is. And secondly, we need the money, really. So what are we going to do? Are we going to allow Apple to pay 0.005% of its profits in Europe, and to bring its money to the US, or are we going to work together? Financial regulation. You know, financial regulation, really has major consequences on the world. There was the Dodd-Frank law, which was American, but I can tell you that actually it has to be implemented by more or less everybody. Now the new Congress is saying that they are going to deregulate. Are we going to work together? So my last sentence will be very clearly, in the 30s, we were facing a major crisis, and we decided, all of us, we decided to go national. Everybody considered that he wanted to solve its problems nationally, and we only worsen the crisis. So today, I really do hope that we will avoid it, and I really do hope that American and European leaders, whoever they are, because also on our side, we will have a different president in May 2017. They try to avoid this nationalism, protectionism, and we try to define together a new transatlantic relationship. Sorry to have been long.
Since we don't have too much time left, I'll try to get to it. The crisis in the U.S. following the Trump election comes at a very bad time because of very serious weakness in Europe. And in a sense, the Brexit vote, the Italian vote, authoritarian tendencies in Poland, Hungary, the decision on the part of Hollande in the face of single-digit approval ratings, high level of unemployment. In a sense, Europe's inability to deal with the twin problems of the financial crisis, high unemployment, stagnation, and a lack of a coordinated policy toward immigration probably determined the Brexit vote and much of that. Unless Europe deals effectively with this and shores up what had been a very solid consensus around the idea of social democracy, which left and right shared in most European countries, it'll be very difficult to do much of anything else. How does one move forward?
Unfortunately, I'm not sure that I have an answer. Really, when you look at the European Union and what I would call the European endeavor, to my total surprise, I didn't think that in my lifetime I could doubt the survival. I could have any doubt about the survival of the European Union. For my generation, the European Union was a sort of a moral, really diktat. Really to avoid, really the wars and in a sense also to in front of the Soviet Union. Suddenly, for obvious reason, Germany is not seen by anybody as a threat, and the Soviet Union has vanished. Really, suddenly we have a problem of a narrative. Why Europe? And in a time of uncertainties, a time of major economic crisis, the people need protection, and they are going back to their national roots. They consider that the national state is better armed, more effective, and it's closer. That's really. On the European Union side, whatever the people say, actually it's democratic, but it doesn't have any democratic legitimacy. We have a parliament which is elected, but it has not succeeded to have a real legitimacy for the men in the street. So what can we do? What can we do? Once going to more integration, getting more federal, saying, well, the British are not there and have blocked everything for the last 20 years, so let's go more federal. The problem is that the man in the street is against it. The voter, all the polls show that the voters are against it. So we have the impression that we are more or less doomed for the moment to a sort of status quo. And the problem is that the question is whether this status quo is sustainable. And again, the answer is jobs, jobs, jobs. The problem is the economic crisis, the high rate of employment. So I really, that's the reason why I do think that we need to define a strong transatlantic policy, is because I do think that we have a lot of obstacles ahead of us. We are not out of the crisis. Really, again, Brexit, because the British had the vote, but a lot of people believe that if you ask the same question everywhere in Europe, you will have more or less the same answer. I doubt it, but nevertheless. And we could have another Brexit with another country. And so the unraveling is not excluded. So there is a real danger, and that's really it means that the leaders that we will have at the end of 2017, because it's not bragging, but I think that France and Germany, especially now that UK is out, will have again a major role. They will have to answer to this question, and they can't do it without the Americans.
But part of that is, it seems to me that so far after the Brexit vote, one possibly good result could have been a serious, honest dialogue about what was not working. And I think the Europeans chose to use an American phrase, they were whistling past the graveyard, hoping that these problems would just disappear if we didn't talk about it and didn't ignore it. The Italian vote, I think, has sent some shivers down many people's spines. It is not inconceivable. Things could unravel in a very, very short time. And a conversation about, I mean, the notion, for instance, that you have mass immigration to Europe that has no coordinated thing. So countries that are among the weaker countries in the Union, like Greece and Italy, are border countries. They face the bulk of the problem. And Europe decides not to say, okay, can we have a structure for dealing with this so that each country does its part, and we're comfortable that on the one hand we're admitting a sufficient number of people to actually satisfy a demographic demand, but that doesn't ruin our countries. There has to be some leadership and some real direction on some of these issues, and flexibility on the employment thing, allowing Greece and Spain to suffer as dramatically as they have has had a great human cost.
No, I think that if you are expecting some Winston Churchill or FDR in Brussels, you can forget it. I think because again, we have been in a sense traumatized in France, but I think it's everywhere in Europe by the referendum in 2005. There was a referendum for a treaty, Treaty of Lisbon, really one of these treaties which was really, in a sense, improving or deepening the European structure. As we say, deepening is a European term. And actually the French voted no. The Dutch voted no. And nevertheless, the French and the Dutch really, a few years later, passed the law, the treaty through the parliament. And the lesson that we have really drawn from this period is that it was a major mistake to ignore the votes of the citizens, and that it has bred, populism, really saying we vote and these elites who are all pro-EU, really basically they ignore us. So there is a sort of really a common wisdom in the European Union right now is we won't change the treaties. Really, let's not touch the treaties. So the solutions that we have been adopting are not very glorious, but we are muddling through. Really talking about immigration, it's very easy, as you have done, to emphasize all the shortcomings. But really, what we are doing, we are creating a common core of border guards. We have an agreement with Turkey, which is not working, which is a sort of working, and we don't have this. We didn't have in 2016 a crisis the way we had in 2015, where we had more than 1 million of immigrants, crossing our borders. So, if we really, again, if we overcome our problems, it will be through this sort of half-baked solutions, technical solutions, because at this moment, no political leader feels that he can really propose a sort of grand solution, a grand plan to the European voters, because these voters are not ready to go on board to accept it.
One thing that concerns many of us as we Americans, but also non-Americans, as we look toward a Trump presidency, is on the one hand he's shown a distaste for American intervention in far-flung conflicts, which some of us find reassuring. At the same time, he spent a lot of rhetoric during the campaign attacking the atomic agreement with Iran. If I'm not wrong, you were involved in negotiations around Iran. One worry one has is that if he tries to walk away from that agreement or change it so substantially that it creates regional tensions there, we could be looking at a very bad situation. How do you read that? Is it possible, on the other hand, that Trump might be capable of a kind of Nixon goes to China sort of thing where he's able to do certain things that a Democratic president might not be able to do in terms of people that are regarded as adversaries? What scenarios might we expect on that front?
That's here at this moment I take my diplomatic hat. No, first, in Washington, D.C., Washington, D.C. is a totally government city. Really everybody is dreaming, sleeping, talking government. There is only that. So in all the dinners I'm invited to, or I invite, really during 2 hours, Republicans and Democrats are trying to guess what will be the foreign policy of the new administration. And usually, after a lot of whining and moaning, the usual conclusion is, we don't know. Really. So I think that's an important element. We really don't know. An electoral campaign, especially in the US, is never very specific. It's really a president who is, actually was a businessman, has really no political past in a sense, and especially in foreign policy. So we have to see what will happen, and at this stage we don't know. It allows us, by the same way, and we are doing it, to pass the messages. Really to say, really here what is important for us, really what we are working together on that, and we would want to work on it. But at this stage, I think we really don't know. For us, we have major issues, which is first the climate change agreement, of course, the Paris Agreement of December 2015. And also, as you said, there is the Iran deal. We do think that the Iran deal should be implemented in a very rigorous way. We know the French have been quite rigorous in the negotiation, but it's working. The agreement is working. Really, there was a quid pro quo. The Iranians have accepted to monitor their Iranian program. It's quite seriously monitored. They have been abiding by their commitment, more or less, but more than less. But there is a quid pro quo. It means that on the Iranian side, the lifting of the sanctions should be a real lifting of the sanctions. So that's the basis of basically the message that we are conveying to the people. But really, we can't even say a new administration because these people are not yet here.
Right. But I was wondering, because of the political pressure that built up against it, whether one more optimistic scenario is that they could make some small change to the treaty and say, you see, we saved the whole thing, we're effectively accepting 98% of the treaty as it exists, but then able to go back to their voters and say, you see, those fools in the Obama administration accepted a weak treaty, we've strengthened it, and the world is safe. Is there some small modification, since you know the specifics of it, that if you were advising them in the most Machiavellian way, here's a small thing, you could tweak the treaty and you can go back and say...
a French diplomat can't be Machiavellian.
Actually, president who was known as before about that.
Yeah, exactly. No, actually, it's not. I'm not going into this direction. I'm more, a lot of what people are saying about the Iran deal is that it didn't prevent the Iranians from having an aggressive policy, in Syria or in Iraq or in Yemen. Really. So they say you should have a global agreement. And our answer, as always, and is still there, saying, no way. We wanted to isolate the nuclear issue because it's so technical, it's so complicated that you can't simply exchange 1,000 ultracentrifuges against Yemen. So but what we are telling the Americans, really, you can have on one side the Iran deal, but it doesn't prevent you from actually having a balancing policy towards Iran. The fact is, and here I'm back to geopolitics, here, you look at the Middle East. Basically, the balance of the Middle East has been destroyed. Why? First, because you invaded Iraq. Secondly, because there is a civil war in Syria. And third, because Egypt went through some difficulties. So the problem is balancing Iran. It's not the Islamic Republic. If it were the Shah or a democracy, it would be the same. It's the Shah who occupied some islands in the Gulf. So really the question is balancing around, and you can do it without, in a sense, undermining the nuclear deal.
One of the issues that, of course, has been huge in France and an issue here as well, which was the problem of terrorism. And France has been struggling with the problem of effectively integrating its minority population, dealing with laïcité. We had the whole Bikini episode during the summer. For France's general health and future, it needs to manage that issue in a way that there's both consensus but not exclusion. You've been in this country where we have a somewhat different way of handling these issues. If and when you go back to the Quai d'Orsay, how would you recommend France better manage that issue so that it itself can be more secure?
You know, on this issue, you know, I've gone to a lot of American universities, and usually, as you can guess, I am immediately the target of all the liberals in the room, and usually everybody is a liberal in the room. So, but I am a history buff, and I try to remind people that every country has its own historical fabric. And for us, as you know, really here, secularism was, in a sense, to defend religion from the state. You know, really, for us, it was to defend the state from the religion. You know, really, basically, and so there is, you know, it's very, first the Burkini, as you may say, you know, it was decided by some right-wing local municipalities. You have the same problem with abortion. You know, really, the Republican states are doing their best to actually to reduce this right. Actually, we went to our High Court, and the High Court struck down the regulation. So that's really the normal game, I should say, in a democracy. So the Burkini is an old story. But the problem that we are facing, in a sense, is accommodating. 8% of our population is Muslim, and you have a tiny minority which is testing us. Which means, and you have to take decisions. And they are not easy. You know, you have people coming saying, I don't want my daughter to go to the gym. Or I really don't want a male doctor taking care of my wife. Or I want to have women-only days in the swimming pool. So we have all these questions which are raised. And again, you have to draw a line. And immediately the liberals say, why to draw a line? Because you draw a line yourself, liberals, but for instance, by forbidding polygamy. Because people say, if the woman wants to wear a burqa, why? If the woman wants to be polygamous, why? You know, we have to draw a line. And again, it's not easy. It's really not easy. You know, you can argue both ways on both issues. We should first say, all these customs, all this attire, they are not innocent. You know, it's not like where, you know, they are representing a misogynistic, repressive, and patriarchal civilization. They are against the equality between men and women. That's a fact. So, what can we accept, or why can't we accept? It depends on each country. And in France, we have a rule that in state schools, public administration, religion, any religion, should be absent. The space should be neutral. So again, I think it's very difficult, impossible for you to understand it, and I do accept. I do accept also the fact that maybe we have committed mistakes and that we commit mistakes, but you have to understand that it's very, very difficult to find the right balance between our traditions, our way of life, and really having our Muslim citizens. And especially because also we are facing the same populist rage that you are facing, which is of course anti-Muslim the same way it is here, and we have had more than 250 of our citizens killed on behalf of Islam. So it makes the debate, the political debate, a bit poisoned. So I trust my country, where I see really, as I've said, the High Court has struck down the Burkini regulations. I think we'll find a way out. But you have also to in a sense, to leave your moral ground and to understand that it's not easy. It's a real challenge right now.
I wanted to open the floor to questions from the public if some have them. You have one there? Yeah.
Merci beaucoup. I just would like to draw your attention to the situation in the Middle East. As we saw over the last years, diplomatic solutions to the war in Syria have failed, different Geneva. Military solutions have also been not very effective. And maybe on this particular point, we see some agreement on the point of view of the president-elect in the U.S. and also the François Fillon, who might become the French president. So where do you see the kind of agreement between the French and the Americans, and also the dialectic between a military solution and a diplomatic solution?
You know, in a sense, when you have a crisis, or the first thing that you have is to define what is happening on the ground, And what is happening on the ground is very clearly that the Russian intervention has really changed totally the terms of the conflict. The Russians have sent a clear message with the support of the Iranians: the Assad regime won't fall. And the Russians are right now sending us the message that Aleppo will fall. So in a sense, the Russians are setting the terms on which, or really on the basis of which, the new American president will have to define his Syrian policy, which means, and these terms are extremely dire for us. First, you have a reinforced Assad regime controlling what we call the useful Syria, really controlling, really this part of Syria. And certainly, whatever he says, unable to reconquer the rest of Syria. So, and on the rest of Syria, you have a lot of different divisions with the presence of ISIS, which is totally unacceptable for the West, but also, I guess, for Russia. So it's on the basis of this reality, knowing that we are not going to send our soldiers, the Americans, and again, a Clinton administration wouldn't have sent soldiers, is what can we do? And again, you conclude in a sort of logical way is certainly difficult, really. So we have to wait for what President Trump will decide, but his decision will be taken on the basis of this stark reality. And you have also to define your goals. Once you have defined your policy, the situation, what is your goals? Basically, for us, the goals is terrorism and migrations. So that's the goals we have. So really how to defeat ISIS, and also how to put an end to the migrations from Syria. And again, I don't know what the president will decide, but of course Russia will say, let's work together. Let's work together. We'll speak of Assad later on, but let's work together. ISIS or Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda should be our common target. And I don't know how President Trump will answer.
Question there.
Mr. Ambassador, good afternoon, and thank you for your remarks. At the beginning of the hour, Madame mentioned fear and anxiety that we feel here in the States. After living for some years in Europe myself, I see the cause of the fear and anxiety in the context of the history of the Second World War. And I think that because of my experience in France, that has given me that insight. And I'm wondering if other Europeans are not concerned because of those same reasons, that there are behaviors that seem to come from World War II. Do the French see that also?
To my total surprise, really recently, the American Jewish Committee said that what the the slurs and the attacks on African Jews in America were reminding them of the Second World War. I think it means that throughout our Western societies, again, we are back, in a sense, back to the 30s. Really without Hitler and without Stalin. Really, of course, and Professor Paxton will say no way, but really, of course, always I said I don't like historical parallels because they are meaningless, and after that I make an historical parallel. So I don't believe in historical parallel. But it means that, in a sense, when you were referring to World War II, I think it's saying something. I was not thinking of that. I was thinking of war. Really, because for us, for me, for my generation, Europe was to make war impossible in Europe. We had 2 world wars. Our continent was physically and morally devastated by 2 world wars, and simply we said at some moment, enough is enough. And for me, when I think of the collapse of the European Union, I think of war. I said it will make war possible. What is, in a sense, we have been too successful. Because for the youth, speaking of war of Germany doesn't make any sense. When I say that, a young French who is 20 years old will look at me and say, what are you saying? Really, what are you saying? I go to Erasmus program, I went to Munich, and really I got drunk with my German friends, and really, what do you mean? It doesn't make sense, really anymore. Really, so that's an element. And of course, we are not going to be at war in Western Europe, but I don't know in 30 years, in 40 years, I'm convinced, because of what I heard around the table of my family, that history is a tragedy. So really, I think it's possible. That's one of my. The second one is, of course, and we see it against the Muslims, we see it against immigration, is that this comeback of nationalism. The fact that the people have been destabilized by globalization, by economic and cultural globalization. It means that they are trying to cling, in a sense, to their identity, to their pride, really to try to have some pillars, some certainty, really, okay, I've lost my job, but I'm only French, really. So you have these feelings. But again, in the 30s, you had also these feelings. I do believe that our societies, again, they have their own anti-core, really have their own defense, and that really the lessons of history are there, even if, in a sense, we have seen the end of the mourning period after the World War II. Really, in my youth, when I was 20, 25 years old, it was impossible to be on the far right. It was impossible. You had 3 or 4% of veterans from the Légion Française contre le Bolchevisme, really, or of Pétainisme, but there were 3-4% and they were aging and vanishing. Really, it was really impossible, and that there was 28% on the far left. And suddenly, to my surprise, I see the far right normalized everywhere. So it's really, but how to handle the far right? And that's a challenge that the traditional political parties have really have problems. So some of them are trying basically to say they are our absolute enemy. There is no way. Really, other people are trying to chase their electors by going to the right. And we saw it during the right-wing primaries in France. Really, one of the candidates who was defeated went very much to the right, really trying to go into the really to try to chase some far-right electors. So that's one of the challenges. Yeah.
One last question.
Thank you very much for, I think, your very thoughtful remarks. But again, one thing which interested me is your insistence on what you call the transatlantic project and how to revise, and the history you presented, I think, contextualized very well your question. So my comment is it possible today to think of this revival outside 2 things which seems to me the basis of the kind of development of populism, the nostalgia of empire from the West, and the very idea that Western identity is going back to its racial and cultural element, which are, actually creating exclusion. And I think his question about how to accommodate these French who are Muslim is part of it. I think the nostalgia is there. We have seen it here with Trump. So is it possible to go back or to rethink this project we insisted on outside this cultural territory? And the second thing, which is also important, because you did not qualify the project, and I think it should be qualified. It should be a political project, because it's about how do we engage politically. And I think that in the European context today, it's a critical issue. So thank you.
No, you're right about it. In a sense, as a son of my generation, I'm a bit Marxist in my analysis of the crisis, and I'm always privileging the economic realities, saying jobs, really, and I'm always reluctant to enter into this identity story, really. But at the same time, when you look at the French society, I've been ambassador to Israel. And one day I was waiting on the carousel, from the Tel Aviv, and there were people, most of them coming from Israel, being Jewish, and the parents were calling each other, and they were calling each other with first name, which was the first name, really, in a sense, Christian first name, Jean, Paul, Pierre. And they were calling their children, and their children all of them had Hebrew first name, really. And Roman Catholicism, really the Roman Catholicism of my youth was the Roman Catholicism of the Concile Vatican II opening to the world. After that you had John Paul II, but Benedict XVI, and you have had, against the gay marriage, demonstration of an identity Catholicism. Suddenly, people were asserting their identity as Catholics. And Muslims, in a sense, is the same. The first generation of immigrants were not asserting their Muslim identity. They were respecting really according to their religiosity, they were asserting their tradition, but really their first identity was to be French, really. And you see suddenly the Muslim identity coming back in the second or the third generation of French Muslims. So again, I may be totally wrong in my personal analysis, but I put a sort of parallelism in the fact that, for instance, really among the Jews, among the Catholics, and among the Muslims, there is this sort of assertion of their identity. And I think the question would be that before, the identity was a sort of French Republican identity. We are going to school, really had all this mythology about Joan of Arc, and really, had one of my best friends when I was in Israel was a professor Barnavi. Really was ambassador to Paris, teaching history. And he told me that when he entered the French school in 1946, he's a family from Jews from Romania, and when the teacher said the very well-known sentence, "Our ancestors, the Gauls," for him, it was incredibly positive. It was a way of saying, whoever you are part of our community. And everybody knows that our ancestor, the Gauls, is not in the sense of the physically, having my grandfather was Vercingétorix, really, that it was a sort of community. And in a sense, this sort of Republican identity has been working for decades. It's not working anymore. And so that's a big question to the French society. What is it to be French? Really? What is it today to be French? Really? So during the campaign on the right-wing primary, which was striking is that the winner actually was insisting very much on the idea of what we call in French le roman national, really to have a national narrative, really, which for an historian is horrendous. Really, it's the negation of history. But basically saying, so that's nostalgia. And, nostalgia and on the far right, utopia on the far left are really frankly, are the problems. But that's one of the questions. Nicolas Sarkozy, who really felt it in 2007, he was the first one to raise this issue, saying we have a problem of national identity. The way he did it was not the shrewdest one, but he did it. So this question is still on the table. What is it to be French today? Really? And especially when the people need to reassert their identity in a global world, feel they need to do it. And it's a fact that apparently France is not offering to its people this national narrative. Because contrary to really people, again, France is not ethnic. We have no ethnic basis, really, and really the French are really, we are, of course, France is obvious. But frankly, between the people living in Lille and people living in Marseille, frankly, when you think of it, really, they don't eat the same way, they hardly speak the same way, their history has been extremely different. Lille is French since 1668, and Nice since 1861. So we are a different country. So in a sense, we have not one religion, and especially now. So in a sense, we need to define our unity, which is in a sense is a bit surprising. But that's really another issue. Really, and you may, especially for the French, but not only of the French, you may disagree with what I have said because I'm not sure that I'm right.
Well, on that note of uncertainty.